17. Later that evening, Katherine was waiting for the dinner bell, her stomach in knots as her anxiety grew. She hadn't seen Sister Nora or Sister Sorcia since that dreaded visit the afternoon. She still didn't know how severe Sister Sorcia's injuries were, or worse, if she was dead. She drummed her fingers across her desk, her leg hopping up and down with anticipation. At last the ding of the dinner bell rang, and all the orphans gathered to descend on the dining room. Katherine forced her way past the group of girls, pushing her way to the front of the queue, and took her seat at the table. Once everyone was seated and silent, the procession of the nuns began. Katherine strained her neck to try to make out if Sister Sorcia was one of them, and sure enough, in the middle of the lineup, there she was. Katherine let out a deep sigh of relief and allowed herself to relax a bit. Sister Sorcia was alive. That was the main thing. She squinted, trying to make out if there were any obvious injuries on the woman. The right-hand side of Sorcia's face appeared to have a tinge of blue, and her top lip was split, but she couldn't be certain. It looked like she had used powder on her face to mask the true extent of the damage. Sister Sorcia didn't make eye contact, keeping her head down just like the other nuns. Katherine started to bite her nails as her heart raced. She wanted to make sure Sorcia was all right, to offer the woman some level of comfort, to return the gesture she had received herself. The fact that the nun didn't even look over at her made her worry. Had she lost the only comrade she ever had in the orphanage? She cast a fleeting glance at Sister Nora, who was grinning at her. She's enjoying this, thought Katherine. She likes that she's blocked our friendship. Sorcia won't ever go against her now, not when she'll be subjected to pain if she does. Defeated, Katherine shrank back in her seat. She wanted to disappear. With shaking hands, she gingerly picked up a spoon and forced herself to eat the bowl of mush that they called dinner. The next morning, Katherine gasped as she plunged her hands deep into the basin of warm, soapy water. The lashings she'd received from Sister Nora the night before had left her with deep lacerations along her spine, making her grit her teeth with every movement she made. But she had no choice but to carry on. Her hands were red and stinging from the heat of the water as she pulled out another frock. She had been scheduled for laundry day, and she still had about 20 more frocks to wash before she could hang them out to dry. She always hated laundry. It had been the one chore that had always refused to help her mother with. She hated how tiring it was to run the clothing over the board multiple times, then wring out each item which was saturated with murky water. Her father's clothes were even worse, as they were heavier than both her mother's and hers combined. They also reeked of cheap whiskey and tobacco, so she had to scrub at the material a lot harder to get rid of the foul stench. Her fingers became all wrinkly and red, and sometimes sore and cracked from the pressure of pushing the clothes against a hard wooden board. With a frustrated sigh, she pushed her hair back from her face with the back of her hand before wringing out the excess water from the frock into a nearby basin. She was so occupied by her thoughts about the task she hadn't noticed someone else had entered the room. She went back to her little stool when she felt the all-too-familiar warmth of a comforting hand on her shoulder. Tears sprang from the corners of Katherine's eyes, threatening to cascade down her face. She hadn't lost her only friend after all. Wiping her wet hands on her apron, she turned to face the woman behind her. Katherine gasped and brought her hands up to cover her mouth. Sister Sorcia wasn't wearing any powder today. Katherine could see exactly what Sister Nora had done to her. Her top lip was split, and the bluish tinge that she had noticed at dinner yesterday was almost purple in patches. From the size of the discoloration on Sorcia's face, Katherine guessed Sister Nora had used a blunt object as her mode of punishment. Instinctively, Katherine reached out to touch her face, but Sister Sorcia shrank back and closed her eyes as if in fear of the anticipated pain. Katherine retracted her hand and looked down in embarrassment, scolding herself for her stupidity. Katherine swallowed a lump in her throat. "I am so sorry, Sister Sorcia. This is all my fault," she said. The nun raised her hand to stop her from saying anything further, then moved with stealth towards the large brass taps at the opposite side of the room. She turned all of them on before turning to face Katherine and putting her finger over her lips. Katherine frowned, puzzled. The nun pointed upstairs, and Katherine understood. Someone was walking around upstairs, and, judging by the unfaltering footsteps, she knew Sister Nora was standing right above them and that, for their sake, they needed to remain quiet. "I'm so sorry, sister," whispered Katherine. The nun shook her head and pulled Katherine into a comforting hug. Katherine froze before melting into the kind woman's arms. She smelt distinctly of frankincense, so Katherine guessed she must have come directly from the chapel. But there was also a hint of sage that Katherine had begun to associate with the woman. "You're afraid of her too, aren't you?" Katherine asked, while toying with her hands. The frail nun was on edge. She kept looking around the room, checking if it was safe to talk. She reluctantly nodded her head and gestured for the young girl to take a seat. The nun pulled an empty basin next to Katherine to provide a makeshift seat for herself. The sheer fear that was written on Sister Sorcia's face made Katherine reluctant to probe the woman further, but she almost couldn't help herself. "What else has she done to you?" Katherine asked, as she placed a gentle hand upon the woman's knee. A silent tear made its way down Sister Sorcia's face as she seemed to be struggling with opening her mouth. This puzzled Katherine, as she couldn't understand why the nun would be trying to open her mouth in the first place when she was a mute. The nun leaned closer to Katherine and pointed, with a trembling hand, to the inside of her mouth. Katherine almost fell from her stool from the shock. She gasped. Were it not for the nun's hand on her arm stabilizing her, she would have knocked over the basin of water. Half of the poor woman's tongue had been cut off. It looked like it had been severed with a blunt, serrated object, causing a jagged, blackened stub to remain in its place. It had been cut right down to the very muscle, which would explain why the woman couldn't speak. She hadn't been born a mute. She had been robbed of her ability to speak by Sister Nora in an inhumane, violent manner. Katherine had to look away from the grotesque sight for a few moments. When she tried to speak, Sister Sorcia once again raised her finger to her lips, reminding her to keep quiet. She pulled a few scraps of paper from her habit, fumbling with them as she arranged their order, before thrusting them into Katherine's hands. Katherine glanced down at the paper, now crumpled in her hands. The nun nodded in encouragement and beckoned her to read the papers. Katherine let out a nervous breath and was just about to read the first slip when a booming voice interrupted her from behind. "I warned you! I warned both of you!" Sister Nora barked in an icy tone. The sound of the running water had masked any outside noise, so Katherine and Sister Sorcia had not heard her enter the room. Sister Sorcia's eyes widened and darted toward the slips of paper in Katherine's hands. Katherine thought Sister Nora hadn't seen what was in her hands yet. She quickly crumpled them up further into a ball and dropped it at her feet. She stood up and discreetly kicked the ball away from them, eager to keep the contents hidden from Sister Nora's eagle eyes. Sister Sorcia moved toward Sister Nora, head bowed in submission and fear. Sister Nora raised her left hand, demanding that the frail nun remain still. Sister Nora directed her chilling words only to Katherine. "You stupid little girl, have I not been clear, time and time again, that your meddlesome ways have consequences? You aren't deserving of any so-called friends within these walls. You are an evil, insolent child, and will continue to be treated as such for as long as I am here. You would think, considering how many times your hands have been cut open, that you would learn to heed my warnings. Perhaps I was wrong. You're clearly too stupid for the message to sink in. I will have to greatly increase my efforts to ensure I won't have to repeat this message again. But what to do with you?" Catherine's eyes skittered to Sister Sorcia, instinctually. She hadn't meant to look in her direction, and Sister Nora noticed. She leaned in towards Catherine, tilted her head back, and let out a raucous laugh. Catherine and Sister Sorcia glanced at each other with caution, their whole bodies trembling. They didn't know what Sister Nora was finding so funny, but they both knew that they were better off not knowing, and chose to remain silent. Sister Nora snapped her head back up and turned on her heel as if to walk away. She clutched the crucifix with one hand while waving a finger between the two of them, as if having difficulty choosing between the two. Finally, her finger stood still in front of Sister Sorcia. She dropped her hand and rolled her eyes, as though bored by the whole situation. But at the last minute she turned to face Catherine and smirked. Her face twisted so much it was almost unrecognizable. She was morphing into a distorted, dark form in front of her. A shroud of darkness descended upon the room as Sister Nora's back became rigid, as if being held up by an unseen force. Sister Sorcia's breathing had started to come in short gasps as she looked on with wide, fearful eyes. She dropped her shaking hands, which had been clasped together in the form of hurried prayer, and dropped her head down further. Catherine wanted to move, but something was stopping her. She was frozen to the ground. She wanted to reach out to Sorcia, but her body was no longer obeying her. The frail nun raised her head to sneak a glance at Catherine. There were pools of unshed tears in her eyes, but even then she managed to offer the orphan a weak attempt at a comforting smile. Catherine allowed herself to smile back at her, even though she knew Sister Nora was observing their every action. But it didn't matter now. It was too late to protect Sorcia, so there was no need to hide their friendship. The fact that Sister Sorcia was able to smile through her stilting fear gave Catherine a smidge of optimism. She looked over at Sister Nora, and in an instant, that optimism died. The nun was staring right back at her with cold, dead eyes, and her arms folded across her body. She smiled at Catherine so tightly, her upper lip receded back into her gums. Sister Nora carelessly grabbed Sorcia by the arm and pushed her towards the door, causing the nun to stumble on her way. From where she was standing, Catherine could tell the elderly woman was sobbing, her shoulders shuddering up and down as each sob racked its way through her body. Sister Sorcia didn't look back once. Catherine knew deep down this would be the last time she would see her. Sister Nora gave Catherine one last smirk as she followed Sister Sorcia, slamming the door shut behind them.